Moscow, the 28th of February 1953. 5 days before Stalin's death. A normal day in the life of Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. As so often, he'd summoned his associates to the Kremlin to accompany him in one of his favorite pastimes, watching movies, especially American westerns. After the screening, he left for his secret dacha at Kuntsevo, 15 minutes by car from Moscow. Hundreds of security police covered the stretch. As always, several identical armored limousines were on the road. No one knew which one Stalin was in, and it was only at the last minute that he chose the precise route.
He did all the planning himself. If his security people tried to set the route between the dacha and the Kremlin, he'd rant at them. Why always the same way? You want to leave me open to assassination? He demanded the route be changed each time.
The driveway to Stalin's dacha at Kuntsevo, 10 kilometers away from the Kremlin. A prohibited area then as now. Few people knew the place, and even fewer had access. Set in grounds covering 25 hectares, it's the dacha of an absolute ruler, sealed off and watched by over 120 security guards. The interior is rather plain, a lot of wood paneling, not a lot of pomp. Stalin's office, which he hardly used anymore. A corridor links the dacha with another building, housing the guards. It also leads to the main salon. Not for eating and drinking, this room, but for conducting world politics. Day and night, especially night.
То есть это я бы назвал дачу важнейшим местом сталинской власти.
In later years especially, the dacha was the center of his rule. He spent less and less time in the Kremlin. He preferred his dacha, even during the difficult war years.
The evening of the 28th of February 1953, around 10 o'clock, an illustrious gathering assembled. Stalin surrounded by his small surrogate family.
There was Beria, the head of the secret police, Malenkov, then one of Stalin's close associates, Khrushchev, the party official, and the military man, Bulganin. These four met nearly every night at the dacha.
Lavrentiy Beria and Nikita Khrushchev. In just a few days' time, they'd be wrestling for power over the Soviet Empire. On that night, though, they were still marginal figures in the power game of the omnipotent Stalin.
Stalin wasn't really interested in what they thought. The Band of Four was a sort of advisory committee in his dictatorship. That's the political component. There's also a psychological one, the need of a human being to talk to others. Stalin simply had no one else he could communicate with. He'd long since pushed his family aside.
Eating, drinking, talking, with Stalin doing the talking. On that night, it was about Yugoslavia, about the renegade Tito, and about the Korean War. Finally, Stalin mocked his stalwarts. They were nothing but little pussies, he said. When he was no longer there, they'd be crushed by imperialism, intimidation and undermining. Guests had to be on their guard, just as Stalin was.
In his later days, he had a paranoid persecution complex. He was afraid of assassination, especially of being poisoned. When Khrushchev or Beria came to his dacha and wine was served, Stalin would always change glasses with one of them. He never drank out of the glass that had been put in front of him, even if the wine came from a bottle.
So they live under this pressure, like in each such brutal monarchy. If he will decide something, it can be your last moment. Bulgarian told my father, coming here, they went to the bathroom, to the toilet. Coming here for the dinner, I never know where you'll go out from here.
That night was not the first time the four had been seriously worried about their future. The 5th of October, 1952, the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Stalin spoke for the last time on camera, a short speech lasting just 5 minutes.
Stalin didn't look well. He was old and ailing. His hair was thinning. He spoke slowly, with pauses. His speech was rather confused. That's the truth. But he was still in charge of the country.
Stalin was no longer the man he'd once been, but he remained the man of steel. The next day, he announced that the Politburo was to be remodeled, with 25 members instead of just 8. A demotion for the old guard.
His plan was to get rid of his closest associates. They were too old. He needed young blood. It was typical of him to swap the leadership nucleus and regularly conduct purges. He wanted to unsettle his associates and make his closest circle submissive.
The next surprise move came shortly after. On the 13th of January 1953, the front page of Pravda bore the headline, "Terrorist Band of Doctors Uncovered." There followed the incredible story that 12 Kremlin doctors had been revealed as murderers and spies. The doctors had confessed to murdering leading party comrades on the orders of Western secret services. The 12 doctors landed in the torture chambers of the infamous Lubyanka prison. Even Stalin's personal physician, Vinogradov, was among them. A fatal decision, as it turned out.
Stalin wanted to hold a show trial against the alleged doctors' conspiracy. He wanted to extend it to cover his old party comrades. He wanted to turn a criminal case into a major political trial.
The beginning of another purge. The band of 4 were united by fear. They had often witnessed just how quickly Stalin could make people disappear. But they all sat there together as though everything was fine. On that night leading into the 1st of March, Stalin was enjoying the conviviality.
They want Khrushchev to dance Russian and Ukrainian dances. He didn't dance Russian and Ukrainian dance, not because he didn't want, but because he could not physically to do it.
Stalin rang the bell. He communicated with his security guards using bells, which were in every room. He wanted more wine. The whole table was reset and the Georgian food served. Satsivi, lobio, all that Georgian cuisine had to offer.
Stalin ate and drank as if he were top fit, but he wasn't. His public appearances had become rare.
Following a stroke in 1949, he could no longer write properly and was basically unfit for work. But he certainly worked on the Stalin cult. He rarely made personal appearances because he looked bad and could only speak slowly. To make up for his absence, his personality cult was blown up out of all proportion.
Stalin was omnipresent. Stalin icons everywhere camouflaged the dictator's absence. And it worked. The people were not worried, even when Stalin was not present on the tribune. In the West, though, rumors were spreading that Stalin was already dead. These were countered by much publicized appearances at the Bolshoi Theatre. But it wasn't always Stalin himself who showed up in the Imperial Box. Enter Stalin's lookalikes.
When I entered the box, everyone stood up. I'll never forget it. In that huge auditorium. The production hadn't started yet. I stood there, and the whole audience got to its feet and applauded. I stood there and clapped back a little, then sat down again. The box was half in shadow. Only my profile could be seen.
The doubles were called on more and more often. One was Felix Dadaev. He's the only one still living. Stalin himself had spotted him and given his approval. From then on, he appeared as Stalin at the opera, at parades, and at other events.
Stalin was afraid of assassination, of course. The cars were armor-plated. I had my orders not to leave the car if something happened. I sat there in the genuine car. Everything around me was genuine. The car, the guards, all genuine. Except for me.
Working as Stalin's double on the route between the Kremlin and the Dacha. Soon these drives would come to an end. The feast in the great dining room was drawing to a close.
My father told that it was evening as usual. They sit there, that Stalin was in the good health and in good mood, and he even joked with them and joked with my father.
At 4:30 in the morning, Joseph Vissarionovich took leave of his guests. It was a regular ritual. He always accompanied them to the door, and the head guard locked the door behind them.
The guests drove away. Stalin withdrew to his quarters. On the morning of Sunday the 1st of March, Stalin did not ring at his usual time. Gradually, the guards started to worry.
Stalin normally woke up at around 11 o'clock. The guards waited for him to ring, but he didn't ring. It got to 12 and 1 o'clock. Then it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were really getting worried.
But the guards didn't dare to enter Stalin's suite to see what was happening. Entering the room of the all-powerful dictator without being summoned was strictly forbidden. Stalin himself had given the order.
The staff were in a permanent state of fear. One false move, even the right move that he didn't like, could get you shot. They were terrified of letting a door slam, or their footsteps being too loud.
All the rules and routines in the house had been personally laid down by Stalin himself. No one could change the rules. The security system was absolute.
But there was no provision for the event of Stalin losing consciousness.
Just imagine what the Stalin era was like and what it would have meant to write something down like, "Should Comrade Stalin be found lying helpless on the floor?" Impossible. No one would have dared to write something like that. Such an eventuality was just not mentioned.
But this is exactly what happened on this 1st of March. Stalin lay helpless on the floor. Time was passing. At around 7 p.m., as always, the mail arrived in Kuntsevil from the Kremlin. It had to be delivered to Stalin as soon as possible, a chance for the guards to act. No one dared, but somebody had to. The guard chosen was called Logachov. It was only shortly before he died that he revealed that he'd been the one to find Stalin here in the small salon.
Logachov ran to him and shouted, "Joseph Vissarionovich, what's happened?" Stalin could hear him, but he couldn't talk. He raised his hand and said something, then started to snore. Three of the guards then lifted him onto the sofa. There was a puddle under him. He'd wet himself. And this sound, the raised hand, probably meant he was cold.
Stalin was carried into the large dining room. The guards were both clueless and afraid. Finally, they tried to inform the 4 stalwarts.
They managed to reach Beria. He and the others in Stalin's closest circle lived 15 minutes away from the dacha, but it took them 2 hours to arrive.
Stalin lay there snoring. Beria said he's just sleeping. The guards tried to justify their actions, saying that they'd found the 73-year-old on the floor in a pool of urine. But Beria just replied, "Joseph Vissarionovich is sleeping. Don't disturb him and don't bother us." And with that, they all drove away.
You can understand the guards. They were afraid of getting involved. They could all have been shot. But Beria should have called the doctors straight away.
But for them it was much easier to think about themselves, not to risk their life and waking him and bringing and saying, "We'll bring here doctors." They violated all the rules. They came to the dacha without invitation, without permission. And then you saw this 100% guard in such conditions, with nobody can see him. It was impossible. So I think it was Stalin was victim of his system.
It wasn't until the morning of the 2nd of March that doctors were finally summoned to Kuntsevil. They arrived just before 8 a.m.
These doctors were scared to death. First, they scared to death because they saw this living god, or don't know, a devil. And secondly, they knew what happened with their colleagues, so they never know would they go home from there or would they go to this MGB prison.
The diagnosis was brain hemorrhage, a stroke. There was no doubt about it. Partial paralysis of the body, breathing difficulties. Stalin was treated here exclusively.
Things looked bad for the immortal one. His condition was critical. His daughter Svetlana was summoned to Kontsevo. Photos from a happy childhood. But the family ties had long been broken. Stalin could not tolerate private life. Stalin's son Vasily also turned up at the dacha, drunk as so often, and he cursed the doctors as murderers. But Stalin was still alive. His breathing was irregular. He was brain damaged, and his blood pressure was much too high. Hardly anyone in the huge Soviet Empire had any idea of the state Stalin was in. Lookalike Felix Dadaev was called back to Moscow from a trip he was on and learned earlier than the others that Stalin was ill.
I arrived in Moscow on the 3rd of March. I was told I was free to go where I wanted, but with a minder. Everything will be explained later. Then I was told that I'd probably have to stand in for Stalin again, because he was seriously ill.
Waiting. To don the mask of the tyrant once more? The outside world knew nothing. Not even Sergei Khrushchev, the son of a Stalin stalwart, heard anything about the stroke, even though his father was constantly in Kontsevo.
My father didn't say that he was ill, because they kept it in secret, and it was against any rule to discuss this, what happened with Stalin, what can happen with Stalin, because he was so suspicious. So I first found that he is ill from newspapers.
On the 4th of March at 8:30 a.m., the announcement came that Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin was ill. The front page of Pravda stated that in the early hours of the 2nd of March, Comrade Stalin suffered a stroke in his apartment in Moscow. The finest doctors have been called in to treat him. A short statement and a few lies. Stalin was not in the Kremlin, but in his dacha. And the best doctors were not sitting by his bed, but in torture chambers.
Two little white lies. Not so difficult. But the date of Stalin's stroke was more problematical. They couldn't tell the truth, because then they'd have had to explain why it took so long for the doctors to arrive. That's why they announced that he'd had the stroke on the 2nd of March.
Otherwise, the bulletins were correct and surprisingly detailed. Body temperature, pulse, even the results of the urine analysis were all reported. One of the first therapeutic measures tried on the dictator was to apply leeches to his neck.
What would be done today? Artificial respiration. He'd have been attached to all sorts of medical equipment. And what did he get? Leeches.
That was the usual treatment for the Russian upper class. Catherine the Great, for example, was treated with leeches after a stroke. Leeches were also the first resort of folk medicine for treating strokes. It's not surreal. It's an old traditional medicine in Russia. Leeches. We love them.
Это русское народное лекарство пиявки. Мы очень их любим.
Yes, they're bloodsuckers. but not to be compared with Josef Vissarionovich. He drank far more blood.
Group portrait was Stalin. The time for such pictures now seemed well and truly over. Stalin's band of 4 stalwarts were now in charge, at least for as long as the tyrant lay helpless on the sofa.
These people wanted rid of him forever, for 2 reasons. For fear of their own lives. Stalin could have toppled and persecuted them at any time. And secondly, they wanted power for themselves. They guessed that Stalin's days were numbered. Why drag it out? They wanted him to die. They didn't actually do anything to bring that about, but nor did they do anything to save him.
The whole country followed the medical bulletins. The people were in shock. The immortal one, ill? Perhaps so ill that he could die? Impossible. The Stalin cult had its effect.
Many would have given their lives just to keep Stalin alive. They were willing to sacrifice their own lives just so he could live. Do you see? It was a success for propaganda, but it was also because of his own achievement as leader of this great country.
The images were etched into the collective mind. For Stalin, for the mother country, that's how the soldiers entered the great patriotic war. Stalin as the symbol of victory and of strength.
When Churchill spoke about Stalin, he stressed that Stalin took over the Russia of the wooden plow and left it as a nuclear superpower. That's what Churchill said.
Это Черчилль говорит.
The 5th of March. The doctors can do no more. The 4 stalwarts prepare for Stalin's speedy demise.
When it became clear that Stalin dying, it was beginning everything just boiling there. It was the Beria in one room, Khrushchev in another room, and they trying to bring these people here and there.
The Politburo had been in session in the Kremlin since 8 p.m. Positions and responsibilities were redistributed.
Georgy Malenkov was appointed chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union, while the current chairman was still alive. The king was not yet dead, and it was too early to shout, "Long live the king."
Beria became the powerful head of the Secret Service. Nikita Khrushchev, the secretary of the party's Central Committee. Nikolai Bulganin, the other member of the Band of 4, became defense minister. Shortly after 9 p.m., the special session of the Politburo came to an end. Beria, Khrushchev and the others made their way back to Kuntsevo. They arrived just before Stalin died. Stalin's daughter Svetlana witnessed her father's death, surrounded by the assembled political leaders. He opened his eyes. It was a terrible look he gave, half mad, half furious, full of terror in the face of death. Then he suddenly raised his hand and pointed upwards, threatening us. The next moment his soul tore itself loose from his body. 9:50 p.m. on the 5th of March 1953, Stalin was dead. Who would be his heir? Just 25 minutes after Stalin's heart stopped beating, the members of the Politburo were again assembled in the Kremlin, in the office of the newly deceased. The funeral had to be organized. The public announcements had to be discussed. The people had to be kept calm. And above all, the rivals for power had to be watched. Nothing as yet was decided. None of the adversaries so far seemed strong enough to establish himself as Stalin's successor.
They deliberately shared out the responsibilities that night in such a way that no new dictator could come to power for the time being. The editor-in-chief of Pravda, who'd been summoned to attend, noticed that Stalin's chair at the table had been left unoccupied. No one had sat there. They were agreed initially that that chair should remain empty. All of them together were Stalin's successor.
The term for that was collective leadership, the magic word intended to conjure up the illusion of cohesion, unity and strength, both outwardly and inwardly. But behind the facade, everything was seething. Everyone in the leadership circle was afraid of Beria. He had control of the police and the secret police.
Of course, Beria had the best cards at that time because it was police state that Stalin created.
He'd grabbed the office of head of the secret police. That shocked the others. They all thought he would now lay claim to the role of dictator, maybe not immediately, but definitely at some point.
Nikita Khrushchev seemed to have been sidelined a little with his new appointment as secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee. Nominally, he ranked far lower than Beria and Malenkov.
It was no first title, first secretary, but it was decided that he replaced Stalin on this position, the same as Malenkov replaced him in the government. And then it depends on you how you will manage this power, what you will do with this power. When Stalin became the General Secretary of the Central Committee in 1921, everybody thought that it was not an important position.
The outside world knew little of the jockeying for power in the Kremlin. People had enough to cope with in taking their leave from Stalin. Just hours after his death, the dictator was already lying in state in the center of Moscow. People made their way here from all over the country.
It was a tragedy. The people weren't just weeping, they were wailing.
Стонал народ, не плакал, а стонал.
Dadayev was called to duty again. He was approached to play the role of the dead Stalin for a major color film about Stalin's funeral.
The director said I might be needed as a stand-in for Stalin. He asked if I was up to it. I told him I didn't know if I could do it at the time. I was very upset.
In the event, Dadayev was not required. The cameras filmed the genuine body. The procession of mourners passed by the original, and the color filming for the last great Stalin cult film went off smoothly.
We were shaken and anxious. We didn't know what would happen next, who was going to lead us. We didn't think there was anyone suitable. There was no one we knew. We just didn't know how to carry on living without Stalin.
Khrushchev and Beria, two of Stalin's possible successors, were standing by. But none of the mourners passing by seemed to notice them. The aura of the dead man was just too overpowering. The flow of mourners didn't let up. Over 1.5 million people streamed past the dead Stalin, day and night.
It was a day of such contrasts. Some were weeping, others were relieved. It's obvious that people who'd been persecuted and the families of those who'd suffered the oppression of the Stalin regime at first hand could finally breathe out on that day. My own parents reacted completely differently. My mother was in tears, but my father was relieved. My mother didn't know what went on in the Kremlin, but my father had worked there as an interpreter for Stalin.
The morning of the 9th of March, the fourth and last day of the funeral ceremonies, the coffin was carried into the mausoleum. At the front, on the left, traditionally the position of the successor, was Beria, a clear signal.
Beria was tough, proactive, and cunning. He wasn't well educated, but he knew how to get what he wanted under the circumstances that existed in that regime. He was a good organizer and very energetic, not merely a party functionary.
The experienced politicians, they understood that it can be any alliance, but if the Beria will be on the top, all of them will doomed. So it was my father who first decided that he can try to resist.
They were still making a show of unity and agreement at the funeral ceremonies in Red Square. The demonstration of collective leadership revealed nothing of the bitter struggle for power behind the scenes. As head of the funeral committee, Nikita Khrushchev opened the proceedings. His adversary, Lavrenti Beria, delivered a noticeably longer speech from the podium of the Lenin Mausoleum.
Наша партия и народы нашей страны.
Having Stalin's embalmed body lying in state next to Lenin was the last unanimous decision by the collective leadership. The battle for succession continued to rage for weeks and months. It ended unexpectedly with the fall of Beria.
I think that he did the mistake not because he underestimated Khrushchev, but because Beria thought too early that now he won.
At the end of June, Beria was driven to the Kremlin for a meeting of the Politburo, completely unsuspecting of what was about to happen to him. He was arrested, relieved of all his offices, and accused of treachery to the party and espionage for the British. The comrades took no chances. 8 months after Stalin's death, Beria, so confident of victory, was shot.
This Stalin law, the last person who was executed was Beria himself.
Nikita Khrushchev emerged triumphant, the radiant victor in the battle for succession. But even in death, Stalin was still omnipresent. Masses of people continued to file through the mausoleum in Red Square.
I went to the mausoleum as well. I looked at all the people around me and thought, if only you knew. That was my state of mind. If you only knew who's standing next to you. I couldn't get rid of it for a long time. My great secret.
It would be some time before Nikita Khrushchev got rid of Stalin. One of his greatest achievements was finally to knock the all-powerful Stalin off his pedestal. 3 years after his death, at the 20th Communist Party Congress, Khrushchev settled the score with Stalin, exposing him as one of the greatest criminals of all time.
When I learned how many people died under Stalin, I changed my mind about him. I shaved off my mustache. I didn't want anything about me to be reminiscent of Stalin. That's why I shaved off the Stalin mustache. And when it started to grow back, I shaved it off again straight away.
In 1961, Nikita Khrushchev had the body of his predecessor, Joseph Stalin, removed from the Lenin Mausoleum, the sacred shrine of Soviet communism. Now he's just one of many buried along the Kremlin wall. The final act of demystification.